trust is critical to every company. And when you break that trust with your users, they will leave the platform. What we need to do is make trustworthiness like table stakes for even getting a seat at the table. There are no ethical companies, right? There are just companies that are capable of making ethical decisions reliably and at scale.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the AI Founders Podcast. My name is Jay. I am your host, and I'm also the CEO and co-founder of an AI product studio called Casper Studios. In today's episode, we had a conversation with Ben Roome. Ben is a AI ethics and edtech founder. He is the founder of Ethical Resolve. They are a consulting firm that does work with large tech companies, startups, to be able to integrate and embody responsible AI practices into their businesses. So the conversation today was really fun. We talked about the arc of responsible technology and responsible AI and how it's been shifting over the past 10 years. We spoke about how to be able to encourage these types of principles and procedures and how to think about it in a way that actually can drive revenue for businesses. And near the end, we ended up also speaking about how founders can be able to integrate this into their own businesses as well, and how individuals should be thinking about these practices every day too. Hope you enjoy. Ben, how are you?
Great. Good to be with you, Jay.
We were just talking about before I hit recording, and we're calling this a Ben and Jay vibe because I think that energy will work out pretty well here.
Yeah, it's exactly. I've literally enjoyed every conversation we've had so much in the past, so this feels super easy.
I have such a good excuse now when I'm having a great conversation with someone, and hopefully they have something to do with AI. And I'm like, you should come on the podcast. Let's vibe even more.
Exactly. Yeah, the vibe with Jay.
The vibe with Jay. Oh, let me try to find that domain name later so I can start a subsidiary of this podcast. I'll get roasted by all my friends, which when you're on the right track.
Exactly.
So Ben, I've been excited to have this conversation for a little while now. You are one of the experts in my network, at least, around AI ethics. And I'm curious to be able to learn a little bit more from you about what that means, like how you help companies with that, how you help startups with that, how you see the world just generally. And I thought a good place to start with just a quick little introduction. Ben, could you give your elevator pitch in terms of who you are, like what kind of work you do, and what you're excited about doing in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you say, I work in AI ethics and responsible AI. I am the co-founder of a consultancy, which just had our 10-year anniversary. The company's called Ethical Resolve. So we have been working for a long time in this space. We've worked with some of the largest companies. I would say about 70-80% of our work is with Facebook, Meta, TikTok, Uber, Accenture. But we also do a lot of work with investors and startups to help them create governance practices. So often what we say is there are no ethical companies, right? There are just companies that are capable of making ethical decisions reliably and at scale. So the way that we usually break that down is we say trustworthiness is a combination of culture and capacity, right? Culture is your values commitments, both individually and collectively as an organization. And capacity is the processes that you put in place to actually realize those commitments. And so what we say is like culture without capacity is empty promises, and capacity without culture is empty practices, right? You've got to have your commitments, and then you've got to have those practices that actually operationalize the commitments in order to have an organization capable of making reliable ethical decisions.
I sometimes get confused of what ethics and governance even mean sometimes. Could you help me define how you think about this and help educate entrepreneurs, executives on, let's maybe step back, that they may not even know that this is a problem for themselves. Definitions might be a little bit loose for them. Like, how would you help them describe what we're even talking about here?
Right. So what we're talking about when we make ethical decisions is essentially about impacts, right? So we're talking about how our technologies and our business models are changing people's realities for better or for worse, right? So we're either going to make people's life and reality better. We're going to generate a positive impact for them, or we're going to harm them and generate a negative impact, right? So we can think through this in a lot of different ways. Like sometimes we think about rights impact, like we have the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Almost everyone knows what a human right is. And of course, rights also extend to plants and animals as well. And so we want to think about what are the impacts that we're making and how can we maximize the positive impacts and then identify risks that might lead to negative impacts and ultimately mitigate those risks before they become harms. So I'd say that's the short answer to this. What we actually do in order to make sure that we're maximizing these impacts is to help create governance systems, right? You talked about operationalization. What we're doing is making sure that every company has a capacity to review its systems, whether they're building and deploying those systems or whether they're just licensing or buying those systems from other folks, right? How can we make sure that the systems that we're using align with our values? What we've got to do is review them. We've got to get a group of smart people who care in the room and decide, are we go, no go on this product, on this feature, on this model? And so then what we've got to do in order to operationalize that process is make sure that this review committee actually has the information it needs to make the right decision. What is going to be the impact of this product? Who is impacted? How are they impacted? And how can we ensure that reality that this product is going to create is an overall positive one?
Since you've been doing this for 10 years, I think you've had I'm assuming you've had a really interesting front row seat in terms of how perception towards tech generally has been shifting, especially over the past 10 years.
Yes, absolutely.
More commonly, you look at the narratives around technology, it feels like it's really shifted with the presidential election of 2016 and Cambridge Analytica. And it feels like that was one of the clear shifts. But you've been doing this work before then. Walk me through, how have you observed that shift happening? And I'm actually really curious about the individuals you had to convince at these companies who maybe for most of their career, or at least most of the time they've been building their companies, they may not even have thought that this was a broader societal issue that they needed to not care about, but not prioritize because they needed to focus on their business. So it's a broad question, but curious to get your reflections on like how that transition has been from the past 10 years up to today.
Yeah, totally. It's a broad question, but it's a good question. I remember hearing things like 10, 15 years ago about how the internet was inherently democratic. Like, the technology we're building out here on the West Coast is inherently good. Like, what could go wrong? And so we were in this like part of the hype cycle of just internet technologies in general, these new communication technologies that like everything is good. We're going to generate data about people. And that means we're going to more effectively understand what their wants and needs are and then be able to deliver those needs to people. And it's, of course, we for 20 years now have been rightfully concerned about security. I would say for the last 10 years, we've been really thinking more and more about privacy, and that's been coming onto Americans' radars. Traditionally speaking, privacy has been very important to Americans, but maybe not as much as it has been to folks in Europe, for instance. But we don't think about internet privacy in the same way. And so in the era of big data, remember when we used to talk about big data? And when Jake, my co-founder, and I first founded Ethical Resolve, we sometimes called ourselves big data ethicists, right? And no one uses the term big data anymore because we all know what all that big data was being collected for. It was being used to train machine learning models. And so now we just call it what it is, which is AI. People were concerned about like, how is this data being used? Like the security question is what happens if it gets leaked and someone steals my identity? But then also the privacy question is like, what happens when people start to make inferences about me from the data that I have willingly provided about information that I have not willingly provided, right? Like these systems are very powerful. And when we generate all this information about what people are interested in, and this goes directly to questions about Cambridge Analytica, election interference, right? Like you can start to make inferences, for instance, about what people are likely to believe if you display misinformation or disinformation in front of them. How likely are they to perpetuate that misinformation or disinformation? And you can get a pretty reliable prediction about them based on their other behaviors on these platforms, right? When we realized that as a society, that was like a big wake up call. And that is around the time we started working with Facebook. We actually worked with them on a 2020 election interference project, which was pretty effective and certainly the direct opposite of what happened in 2016. And so that was really powerful powerful and helped folks to wake up. Like it was at that time that we started not having to tell these really detailed and nuanced stories. And instead we could just say the emotional contagion scandal, the Cambridge Analytica scandal, right? Like all of a sudden everybody knew what you were talking about. And so then there have been these other stories that emerge in the press, right? There have been like HR tools that do sentiment analysis, but don't function for people of color. And so then we're getting these really disastrous unfairness situations where people are like relying on these tools, these sentiment analysis of hiring videos, of interview videos that are just not fair. And so we are now seeing these in all sectors, right? Of course, Gen AI has been the big thing in the last 2 years, right? Everyone probably has heard the story of an attorney who filed a legal brief that was generated by GPT, and it generated case law that does not exist. And this person filed it without making sure that the case law existed. And so that was a major moment of embarrassment, right? And we see just all these cringy things that happen. And every time a new one like comes onto people's radar, I think they get what I do for my career more and more.
I'd love to learn about that, the 2020 Facebook. But what was shifting at that point? How did you help them run through that process so that some of the negative things that happened in 2016 didn't happen again? What practically were like, how did you help them go through that process? What were they looking for your support on that?
Yeah, my co-founder Jake and a team of very smart researchers provided a lot of research on the way that inference can be used in order to generate other forms of inference, and what types of inferences should be made available to people who are looking to purchase ad space on the platform, and what sorts of inferences should not be made available. And so what ultimately the conclusion is that like we should be allowing people to be served ad content or political content based on choices that they have explicitly made, not about inferences that are being made about them from other information that they have provided, right? Jake sometimes at the time was talking about like the technical definition of creepiness, right? Which is like when a machine learning system makes an inference about you in one domain based on information that you have willingly provided in other domains. And so we consider information that we have willingly provided in the field of play, right? This is legitimate information for you to use and make inferences about, and ultimately to serve me ad content or political recommendations. But what we don't want to do is make inferences about people that they have not been willing to share. And so ultimately it's like, how do we avoid creepiness on the platform at a very broad scale?
That's hard to operationalize. Coming from a big tech company myself, sometimes we hear this like the creepiness, and I think the public will say, yeah, that makes sense. But when you're internal or you're working with their internal teams, those are really hard decisions to try to figure out, because like practically what I think that would have meant is you have one product manager in one area of the business that wants to be able to like grow like this specific metric by amount. And to do so, it would be really helpful to just understand that user a little bit better. And if they did, then they can craft whatever copy, messaging, et cetera, to attract them to start using that other product.
Yeah.
And so it's probably as like when you say it like that or hear it like that, it sounds like, yeah, sure, go grab that data, go figure it out. But then you do that and you compound it across everybody and every user and every product team, then it does become a lot creepier.
Yes.
So how do you then get into, walk me through in that specific and that example or an example like that. How do you actually end up stopping that? Because that's tough I would have escalated that up to my product executive person and be like, we need to do this. If we don't do it, we're not going to hit our metric. And then we need to change our metric. And then we need to change our financial projections and start unraveling pretty fast.
Exactly. And that's the thing is when we walk in the room, usually it's like the legal team or someone from the information security team, or it's someone from corporate risk management and audit, right? We walk into the room with the product and engineering folks and they're like, oh, great. Here's the engineers. Now I'm definitely not making my product deadline. Like my OKRs are not getting met, and so what we're always trying to do is implement a practice that implements just the right amount of friction so that they don't make an ethical mistake that lands them in more hot water than just not meeting a deadline. And obviously we want to help you meet your deadline. And so we're always trying to implement a practice that's, look, what we're trying to get you to do is just when you're in the ideation phase, ask that ethical question, right? We want to go deploy a new feature to this product. I'm a product person and I'm going to the data science team. Hey, get me insights on this type of user, right? We've got this great thing and we want to target a bunch of advertising to them, right? We're trying to get their attention. We're trying to change their behavior, et cetera, et cetera. How are we asking that question about that user? Are they going to be cool with us targeting this? Did they, when they use the platform in a certain kind of way, did they think, okay, I am making a certain identity choice that's going to open me to this kind of attention from within the organization? And so then it's like the data science team, the engine team, the product team. We want them to be asking those questions during ideation, right? What are going to be the actual impacts of talking to this kind of person in a particular sort of way, changing the UI, altering their experience in some way that's going to ultimately get them to change their behavior? Is this change in their behavior good for them, or is it just good for us? Who else is it going to impact downstream? Maybe it's good for them, but it's actually helping them to engage in some sort of exploitation down the stream, right? Like, we want them to step back and think big picture about their impacts. And then from that place, determine, okay, here's the new model that the data scientist is going to train that's going to put it into the product. And here's a model that we realize we probably shouldn't be asking this question, right? Or at least we built this model. It generated a certain kind of insight that maybe could make the company money. If we deploy it to product, who is it going to harm? And might that land us in a place where we are all of a sudden breaking trust with our users, running afoul of the press, increasingly running afoul of legislators, right? Of the FTC. There's all this stuff in the FTC right now about algorithmic collusion. I was just reading an article today about how they raided a company that's been engaging in allegedly algorithmic price fixing for landlords, right? They're collaborating. How much can we raise the rent on our tenant every year? And the FTC is like sending the FBI in to arrest people now. Like, the stakes are getting higher and higher every year. And so it's think about these problems before you build that product. All right. I know that was quite a diatribe, but hopefully it's helpful.
No, yeah, I love it. It has changed a lot. Even when I started my career in the workforce, even the way that people were communicating about users or members and the requests that the product manager was making of that data scientist to go get a bunch of data. I forget the term. It's like minimum viable data. Or
sure, yeah.
What's that term called? The idea is that it's like you should only be getting the data that you like minimally want.
Right.
I
yeah.
feel like that's a new concept over the past 5 years.
All that's necessary and only what's necessary, right? Yeah, people talk about data valuation practices too. We talk to clients all the time that are like, we are paying millions for cloud servers storing data that we know for sure that we do not need. And back in the day, it was totally Wild West. Collect all the data. I learned recently that Google didn't even have a way to delete user data until 2009. They could disconnect it from a user profile, but they actually did not have the capacity to delete user data. And then it's like all of a sudden they became more and more aware that like security is one thing, but privacy, it's critical to be able to delete user data that you don't understand. And back in the day, it was just like every platform was collecting every piece of data they could possibly get their hands on. Now, what they're realizing is that unless you know what you want to do with that data right now, that's not an asset, it's a risk. And so just don't collect it in the first place. Whereas I think a lot of times we would hear people say, oh yeah, just collect it all and then we'll figure out if we need it later. We don't know what sorts of insights we might be able to generate on our users that might be value in the future. So just collect it all, store it all in perpetuity. That is not the same story anymore right now. There's all kinds of regulations about these things. And ultimately it's bad business practice. It's wasteful to be storing this data on cloud servers that your company doesn't need.
It's also depending on the context. Like I'm coming from a BD partnership lens at a tech company. And a lot of the times it was not strategic to be able to provide different fields of data across your platform to another platform. Whereas, I don't know, if I was a BD person for Coca-Cola, I would go to a grocery store or a Whole Foods and negotiate where are my products being placed in a grocery store. And that would be my term of negotiation, my key terms. Whereas for a tech company, a lot of the key terms are around what fields of data are being passed back and forth. And so it's not just risk, it's not just regulation, it is all those things, but it's also just strategic. Like you have to be mindful of how much information you even want to be able to collect and then how much information you want to be able to provide out, which kind of leads me to when founders or when business owners are thinking about like how to be able to implement some of these practices, I think one way that you probably have seen success is that you just tie it to revenue, or you tie it to decreased cost.
Yes.
In terms of revenue, it's off the cuff, improve trust on your ecosystem or your platform. Yes. That drives more customer revenue, drives more users, members, et cetera, to spend more time on your platform. That is supportive for you. That was one of LinkedIn's values. And I saw how important it was. And then the decreased costs go to more like regulatory pieces, go to if you acquire more data, you have to have more processes, which then increase costs. So walk me through how you help companies think about governance, like regulatory considerations from a revenue and cost perspective, because I think that's probably where you're seeing most of the success, because business owners are like, I have to do this because it'll increase revenue or decrease cost.
Yeah, I love this question. And it's an emerging narrative that I think people are really starting to understand, that it's like there is clear return on investment from responsible AI practices. And I think in the past, people have thought, oh, we're doing this because we want to do good. That's not all, right? Trust is critical to every company. And when you break that trust with your users, they will leave the platform, right? You've got to be a careful steward of their data and continue to engender trust with your practices. So I've got a couple great examples of this, because I just wrote an article actually about the ROI of RAI in healthcare. Interviewed two founders of two different Bay Area healthcare tech companies, one called Decoded Health and one called Mednition. So Mednition is basically the leading sepsis modeling company in the country. They just got what's called a breakthrough device designation from the FDA, which is a big deal. Sepsis modeling has been a disaster throughout the history of this space. And I won't name any names, but there is a very large electronic healthcare records company who has launched a sepsis model that does not work, right? They claimed that it was like 70% accurate. It turned out to be 50% accurate. Like, we need something better than coin flip here. And then they went to rebuild it. And then they were like, okay, now we've got it. It's working. It's accurate. 80% accuracy. Some more field trials got done. It's not much better, right? Mednition has made this incredibly accurate model, and they've done that by engaging in really good responsible AI practices. They have a team of 10 clinicians. The company's very small, but they have a team of 10 clinicians that are like actually using this in the field. Whenever they append a new data set to the training data set, any one of these clinicians can veto this new addendum to the data set. They can veto new features that are going to be used in the model. So every one of them is looking very carefully at curating exactly the features that are going into this model. The data set is also incredibly carefully curated. And so they have generated sepsis prediction that works like 40% better than anything else in the field. And this is critically important to clinicians, right? We're talking doctors, we're talking nurses who work in ER triage. It's got to work. It's got to be as accurate or more accurate than their own clinical expectation based on their expertise that they've grown over 10, 20, 30 years in the field, right? And so, you know, the way that Christian Riley, who founded this company, put it was like people in this community are very collegial. They talk to each other, right? Does this thing actually work? Is it going to work? If it doesn't work for one of them, they're going to be talking to everyone. What he said was like, basically, like, if I push bad code, if I push a bad product and it stops working, like, I'm going to lose everybody, not just that user, right? And so similarly then, like for Decoded Health, they've worked a lot on explainability, right? How can their models' predictions really be fully understood by the clinician that is using the tool, right? And that it's going through a reasoning process that's like the reasoning process that they would use, right? This is what creates trust. And so what he said is it's reduced their sales cycle. It's reduced their cost of customer acquisition. It's increased lifetime revenue per customer because it's a tool that thinks the way that they are using it, right? So this kind of like increased revenue is a critical piece. The other side of this angle is that when you don't do this, you create ethical debt, right? Technical debt that is about like the ethical practices or the ethical malfunctioning. Right now, you've pushed this product that like maybe it's making you a lot of money, but you're starting to realize that it's causing harm. Like when you look at Facebook's stock price after the Cambridge Analytica scandal, they lost like almost 50% of their market cap as they implemented and had to change the whole platform in order to do these things. So like the cost of the company is very real if you do this Wild West mentality and then end up having having to go back and make a bunch of changes to your product later on. So there are cost centers and there are clear revenue streams. Also, the other thing we've seen is that just like recruiting and retaining the best talent, you've got to have a company that is ethical, right? People will jump ship and go find a better company to work for if they don't feel like what they're doing is helping to make the world better. Like we hear that kind of in Silicon Valley, the TV show, make the world a better place. And it can seem trite, but people do really care about that. They want to work for a good company.
My one of my broader takes of hearing you speak about this is I am very, proud of the work that you've done. I think my impression of how you've been in this industry is that there's been times where you may have had to really help educate and pitch the value of these concepts, where it feels like now there's still work to be done, but there's a ton of tailwinds at your back finally, whereas it's larger companies or like startups that are waking up to what you're mentioning. Is that how you're feeling now these days? Is that the sell is easier in terms of integrating some of these technology or integrating some of these ideas into companies and into the workforce? Or do you still feel like it's just an uphill battle?
That's a great question. Honestly, so there's sort of an adoption curve for every product or service, right? Like you've got your early evangelists, folks who have believed from the beginning, and then you've got your skeptics. And I still run into skeptics all the time. So I'm not saying like they don't exist, but certainly I meet way more people, like just when I encounter people casually, right? Like I spend a lot less time actually explaining like what I do. And now more and more when I tell people like I work in responsible AI and AI ethics, people are like, wow, that is so important. Thank you. And so that's like always really rewarding that people are getting why this is important. But then when we get into a company and have to talk about the value propositions, right? Like whenever you're thinking about your customer, how do I talk to them? What's their problem? Do they know they have a problem? How do they talk about that problem? And more what we're seeing is, and I think this is the big thing, is like when we were first in this industry, like a big company would frankly run afoul of the media. And then they would call us like, it's very easy to approve budget for our services when you've got a media disaster like taking place right now. Like people in these positions don't want to be putting out fires. And so then the narrative that we're often crafting is, look, how can you go from putting out fires to getting your arms around this problem and creating a systematic set of processes that will allow you to engage in governance throughout the organization so that you can make consistent ethical decisions at scale, so that instead of letting this thing catch fire, you already knew you've got like a pile of tinder over there. And like, how do we make sure that a spark doesn't land on it? How do we do the necessary clearing? I live up in the Sierra Nevada foothills. So especially at this time of year in the fall, the fire metaphors are top of mind for all of us and all of us out here in California. And so it's like, how do we keep this from catching fire? Like, how do we engage in the right sorts of management practices to avoid these things? And I think that sort of thing is like step one. How do you avoid disaster? But as time has gone on, and I love that sort of story about how this actually is going to create organizational value to you by creating increased value for your users, right? Ultimately, at the end of the day, every tech company's job is to provide values to its users. And so when we think about better ethical design, we're thinking about how to make sure this product works better for everyone. And that is clearly aligned with the goal of every company.
You should talk to the LinkedIn team if you haven't already. I think there's some fun stories and case studies from there. When we were launching our verification offering to provide like verification for members, for companies, etc.
Yes.
One thing, and for the audience, I could speak to this a little bit more coherently, was part of the team thought through some of these things. And one of the framings that we tried to push was, how do we make trust a offensive form of strategy versus a defensive form of strategy? Yeah. Because when you think of trust, you think of fighting fires and you think of, oh no, something bad happened, let's fix it with something. And I think flipping that to, how do we take advantage of this and how do we be trust forward? Because if we are, then we know that it'll increase our revenue, our business, etc. And I think that's starting to happen. It was already happening at LinkedIn, and I think the verification work stream generally has supported that. And so taking an offensive form to this stuff can really benefit you. One funny idea that I was thinking about was, you know how like sales professionals go through like sales enablement training, and they learn how to pitch to a customer and what to say. And that's like investing in sales training is something that a lot of all enterprise companies do as if they have a sales force. It's just like a part of doing business. They hire sales development and account executives, and they hire sales enablement people to help enable those same professionals. And it's just obvious because it drives revenue.
Yeah.
I think over time, and maybe already today, your work can also be framed up as something similar where like sales, like it is sales enablement to be able to learn these concepts better. And it does help drive sales in different ways, whether that's through your product or whether through your enterprise sales motion, because of how important trust is, and trust will continue to be.
Yeah.
And I wonder if that is what you end up also following that tailwind over the next 5 to 10 years. I hope that.
Yeah. I love that you're saying this. And actually, I'm going to see if I can just grab this quote real quick because it's so aligned with this article that I just wrote and one of the interviews that I just did. Short, I interviewed the founder of this company, Decoded Health, and he was talking about how explainability and trust like directly relate to his sales process. So what he says is explainability goes hand in hand with trust. Explainability is not just a recitation of all the information. It's a cognitive thought process. That means you have to spend a lot of time understanding the thought processes of the user and mapping your system to that thought process. And so then he talks about how this shortens the sales cycle, because basically like you understand what your user is actually looking for. He says the sales cycle is compressed because you've got a more refined, targeted articulation of value and differentiation in a language that your customer understands and believes. And so it's what we're seeing right now is that 10 years ago, all the AI was concentrated to these companies that had enough money to invest in it because it was part of their core business model, right? The Googles, the Facebooks, the Ubers, right? Like they had so much money and like it was incredibly expensive to develop these systems. Now what we're seeing is smaller organizations providing AI in every different form you could imagine as a third party system. And so now what we're seeing is like every company is becoming an AI system because you can just license it, every company is becoming an AI company because you can just license all these really powerful tools. And so now AI and the questions about ethical AI become a problem of procurement, right? And so on the side of the people who are purchasing these systems, right, it's like, how can we generate the right kind of policy or AI strategy to figure out what systems to adopt to ensure that they align with our organizational values? And then on the other side, it's if we are selling these systems to a potential customer, how can we make sure that we are generating trust with them and making sure that they know that they can use our systems responsibly? So we're starting to see there's a company called Armilla that is actually they're measuring the effectiveness of models so that people can purchase insurance and warranties of the functioning of models, right? All of these things that are like helping to shorten the sales cycle by increasing these actual trust practices within the organization.
What are some of these bigger rocks now with generative AI entering into the scene from an ethical, like responsible AI perspective? What are the top two to three key problems that people are nervous about that you're trying to talk to companies about?
Yeah.
One of them feels like how much my data is being trained by different model providers to be able to enhance different models for the future. Whether I think famously it's known that Reddit was used for a lot of the early models for GPT-3, I believe. I think there's like some drama in terms of where the video models or Sora being trained by YouTube. And so that feels like one of the important problems that need to be figured out. But what are the other pieces, at least now with Gen AI entering into the scene?
Yeah, great question. One of the ones that's been big on my radar lately is stable diffusion. So my friend Dave Harris has been really pushing because stable diffusion was trained on just like a massive amount of the public image content on the internet. It turns out like this data set basically contained some data that like in effect, like is child exploitation. Like it contains some data that like is effectively child pornography. And so Dave has been really trying to draw attention to this. Like they did some really good research at Stanford about basically proving this. And then now I think Hugging Face has just taken down Stable Diffusion. And so we're starting to see this kind of grassroots, like community activism around like these big public Gen AI data sets. And it matters how your model is trained. I think we've uncritically scraped the entire internet. There's also just a whole bunch of IP concerns in there about who's artists, right? If artists put their data on the public internet, on social media, on any of these artist forums where people are able to share their art, right? Like all that information is just scraped. And now this model can generate art in their style. Like you can ask it to generate art in the style of Picasso, and it'll do that. Obviously, that's fine. Picasso is in the public domain, but there are living artists whose art is effectively being stolen from them in this space. The Gen AI stuff, like the like text content generation, obviously the hallucination stuff is really important. There's a bunch of stuff about like companies that are worried about their team members sharing private user data. Someone from the sales team, someone from the marketing team is looking to get some quick insights on how they can improve their process. And so they're like sharing secret data sets. They're sharing trade secrets in some cases. And we never know like how the outputs are going to be generated. Like sometimes it looks like this data is actually being used as outputs, right? They're, as you say, they're using it to train subsequent iterations of the model. So that's a really serious concern as well. I think there's some really interesting things also in text to image around questions of diversity. So like when we ask a text to image algorithm to generate outputs, show me a doctor, show me a firefighter, right? All of the data set that goes into this, it's going to show far more white male doctors, more male firefighters, but we don't want it to distribute that. We don't want these systems to perpetuate that that bias. And so now we're retraining the outputs through a variety of different processes to give us more diverse outputs. So we're seeing people of color and women expressed when we ask it to show us a doctor. Someone made one of these systems generate an image of a black Nazi. So it's trying to get diverse things. And so I don't think we need anyone to tell us why that is horrible. But that's a nuanced use case here, right? That's not a non-trivial problem to solve. And so then it's a case of who is responsible for this and how can we address this problem while also maintaining the diversity of outputs and contexts that's a tricky problem.
Oh my God. At least I was feeling really good about all the amazing progress over the past 10 years. And now as we're entering into this phase of the conversation, I'm like, oh my God, there's even just being on Twitter and LinkedIn and seeing all the AI generated video, like photos. It's getting so perfect.
Yes.
And how are we ever going to be able to really understand what is fake and what is real? And that just, not even just from an image perspective, that feels probably like the biggest, at least like the top 3 issues of our society today, is that we just don't know we think what is real is fake and what is fake is real. And there's just the debate last night, this is being recorded on September 11th. The debate was yesterday. And it's become assumed now that, some parts are lying and some other people are lying about this stuff. And no one really knows which one is actually a lie or not. It feels like we've just gotten used to it now. But what steps can we take towards trying to help improve some of these processes or problems around this idea of we don't know what is real anymore, we don't know what is fake anymore? Good question, right. But what's been happening? What are you seeing in the space? What are some small steps that people can take?
Yeah, man, there are so many stakeholders here and so many different folks working in this context. Again, actually, David Harris is one of the most thoughtful commentators in this space on election interference. And so I highly recommend following his work. I think ultimately, it's a company by company basis, right? We know that Facebook and TikTok are taking steps to think about how their platforms are going to be involved in potential election interference. Pretty terrified about Twitter/X, whatever we're calling it now, because the first thing Elon Musk did was fire their entire ethics team. Like they had one of the best ethics functions of any company in Silicon Valley, and Musk just came in and was like, "You're all gone," same day, which is terrifying. And of course, it's clear that he does not care about the impact, right? Like I would say it's believable to think like he will be intentionally engaging in some form of election interference. There will be deep fakes of all of the candidates before this election. We will see deep fakes of Harris. We'll see deep fakes of Trump. We will be very interested to see how these things get addressed. But ultimately, in the meantime, right, like we've been talking about media literacy, like in terms of just we as individual users, right? Like we've got to do everything we can to educate ourselves, to stop and think, wait, am I taking this at face value? Is it likely that this person really said that? How inflammatory is it? And what are my own cognitive biases that make me likely to believe one thing over another, right? Like we're in this era, I don't know, we're in like a post-truth era. And it's crazy to think about this, right? Like my background is in academic philosophy. And so we ask questions like, what is truth? What is reality? And we are seeing these AI systems to create new realities, to create new modes of truth production. And it's fascinating, but it's also terrifying. And so we need to think collectively about what it means to create truth. And I think it's really important to think about narrative, right? What are the narratives that we are most likely to believe? How do those narratives, our overarching narratives about reality, lead us to conclude that one piece of information is true and another one is false, right? What are our own, how does the background information and the stories we tell about what's going on in reality make us more likely to believe one thing about someone over another? And then how do those narratives get perpetuated by the types of conversations that we have as individuals and on the internet, right? And so the more we can think about these things, I think the more we can bring a critical lens, a careful, thoughtful lens that asks us to pause before we share that story, right? Before we make a reaction, before we go out and troll someone. How can we become more responsible members of this collective conversation that we're having as a global culture?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there too, which I would love to. I want to be mindful of our time too. I think that maybe the last piece I'll respond to that is maybe it loops back around to incentives. And by incentives, it's what are the behaviors and things that I need to be doing as an individual or a company to make sure that people trust me? Because I know that if people trust me, I believe that if people trust me, then that'll be better for me. It'll be better for me to do business with people. It'll be better for my business to do business with other people. Like people will be my friend. It's just like the more kind of foundational human elements of I want to be a trustworthy person selfishly, so I don't feel lonely, so people will include me, so I get opportunity. And I think I'm optimistic on the fact that we are, as you're pointing to, in this phase of really trying to like refine the things that are really important to us as humans and then apply it on the internet. And I don't know, I'm confident that we'll figure it out. It's just taking maybe longer, or maybe it's not taking longer because it's only been like 20 years, 30 years. But I do think over the medium to long term that the same signals that we get when we're in person and we see that someone's just full of shit, and we don't want to be next to them, and we just get like that gut feeling. And sure, a percentage of people will end up kind of screwing people over because they're just straight lying. But the percentage of those people amongst the rest of the world is not that much.
Right.
And so what happens when that's applied on the internet? Where we're like, like the it's not real. And then you just, that person loses the incentive to even promote those types of things because it's just going to hurt their trust and going to hurt their like earning potential, what they can do in the workforce. I know when I'm creating content online, I'm making sure it's real and it's not bullshit. And because I know that that's important for me to be a thriving individual in this economy.
Right.
And so I don't know, I think that maintains, but there will obviously be edge cases here and there where that is not going to happen.
Right. I really like that articulation that it's, look, we all crave belonging, not only just for ourselves as humans, but also it's critical for our functioning within the broader economy, right? Like the basis of opportunity is trust. And I think we, to some extent, have prioritized short-term gain over long-term positive impact. And what we need to do is make trustworthiness like table stakes for even getting a seat at the table. That it's, look, like I'm not necessarily advocating like just like silencing people, but at the same time, it's whose voice gets amplified that needs to be determined based on their trust. Like I'm a deep proponent of free speech, right? Like people should be able to say whatever they want to say, even if it's vile. But, who we include in our discourse, right? Whose kinds of narratives we perpetuate. We want to be really thoughtful about these things. And we need to ask both ourselves as individuals and the corporations that are functioning as the basic unit of production within the broader capitalist economy. Like, we need to hold them accountable, right? To say, look, if you breach our trust, we're just going to not use your platform anymore. We're not going to use this product. We're going to walk away and find an alternative. And we also need to incentivize better companies to emerge, ones whose values commitments have been well articulated and realized from the beginning, from the inception of that organization, so that those are the ones that ultimately, are the ones whose job it is to amplify the most positive and trustworthy voices within our culture.
You can have freedom of speech, but freedom of distribution,
right,
maybe the formula is that trust is an accelerator of that.
Exactly. It's okay. We've got freedom of speech, but there's no need to hand people who are generating intentional falsehoods a megaphone.
Nor should we want to listen to them. We need to take ownership over that too, and not just say Facebook, like LinkedIn, Google, they'll figure it out, right? Like we both parties, quote unquote, need to take some level of ownership over that too. It's easier said than done. It's easier said than done.
And that's why this is a personal choice to some extent, right? Because these companies and so many internet companies have been designed to optimize time on platform. They have been designed to optimize getting your attention and retaining your attention. And it's the same reason why humans can't look away from a train wreck. Like, watching disaster, even though it's bad, it's like, of course it's going to hold our attention. And these platforms to some extent have actually been based on that, like this weird human incapacity to like not be able to look away from bad things, like things we know are awful, but they still retain our attention. And so we have to exercise individual discipline about what we give our attention to and the platforms we give our attention to and how they are trying to court our attention.
Ben, that was awesome.
Yeah. So much fun talking with you.
Anything else you want to leave with, or?
Yeah, no, I think we covered a lot of great bases. I love the conversation and the questions that you've been asking. But I think if there's one takeaway I hope people get, it's just that you as an individual and within the organizations that you work for, right? Like, this responsible AI does not have to be an either or, like either we prioritize our ethical decisions or we prioritize value and revenue, right? These things can go hand in hand. They can be done in conjunction. And you asked a great question about that earlier. Like, that's really the critical thing, is that we need to make this part of our economy, not like antithetical to the growth of good systems that generate revenue and create economic growth.
And I'll say this again, thank you for all the work that you're doing, Ben. It's important, and it happens behind the scenes, and it happens in big companies and small startups, and you're doing really important work. So please keep it going.
Yeah. Big thank you. I will continue to carry the torch as long as possible.